The wind cut across the plains like a blade, sharp and unrelenting, tearing through Luke's coat and biting at his skin. Snowflakes swirled in a chaotic dance, blinding him as he guided his horse along the frozen trail. He had seen winter storms before, harsh and unyielding, but this one felt different, more merciless, more urgent. Something caught his eye. A small figure stumbling through the snow, barely keeping her balance. Even from a distance, he could tell she wasn't dressed for this kind of weather. Her coat was thin, her gloves ill-suited for the frozen winds, and her steps faltered as if the cold was already stealing her strength. Luke's heart clenched. He'd faced many dangers on the plains, wild animals, gunfights, stampedes, but nothing had ever stirred him the way this did. Without thinking, he nudged his horse forward, snow crunching under the hooves, until he reached her. She was barely conscious, her lips blue, her fingers trembling so violently it made his own hands ache. She looked up at him, with eyes that flickered between fear and disbelief, and the desperation in them made something deep within him snap. "Get on," he barked, voice rough but urgent. He dropped a worn blanket from his saddle over her frozen shoulders. "Quickly, my body can warm you up." She hesitated, shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard it made a hollow sound. Luke didn't wait for her to argue. Gently but firmly, he hoisted her onto the horse behind him, holding her close against his chest. She trembled against him, the icy chill leaching through his coat, but he refused to let go. The horse slipped and struggled over patches of ice, but Luke kept his balance, his eyes fixed on the nearest cabin he knew was a few miles ahead. He could feel her body, frail and trembling, pressed against him, and though he tried not to, his chest tightened with worry. When they finally arrived at the cabin, Luke threw open the door and pulled her inside. The contrast was immediate. The storm raged outside, but inside the fire in the hearth glowed warmly, casting flickering light across the wooden walls. He helped her down onto the quilted bed his late mother had made, her body shaking uncontrollably as she curled into herself. He knelt beside her, rubbing his hands together before placing them gently on her arms, trying to coax warmth back into her frozen limbs. I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible, cracking under the strain. "I can't feel my legs." Luke's chest tightened. He had seen people freeze before, had watched the snow take lives despite desperate attempts to save them, but seeing it in her, the helplessness, the fear, was a punch to the gut. He didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her, but it didn't matter. She needed him, and that was enough. "Shh, don't fight it," he murmured, rubbing her arms in slow, steady circles. "Just let me help. You'll be all right." Hours passed with him sitting beside her, feeding her warm tea from the iron kettle, rubbing her arms, whispering reassurances. Her teeth still chattered, but gradually color began returning to her fingers, to her cheeks, to her lips. She murmured incoherently at times, the words lost in the wind that still raged faintly outside. Luke kept his focus on her, holding the blanket tighter around her shoulders whenever she shivered too hard, muttering a curse at the storm for ever existing. When she finally opened her eyes fully, Luke could see the striking green irises that seemed to glow even against the dim firelight. There was a startled awareness there, as though she could barely believe she was alive. Who are you?" she asked, her voice weak, quivering with both fear and disbelief. "Name's Luke," he said simply, though his voice carried more warmth than usual. "I found you out there in the snow. You'd have frozen solid if I hadn't stopped." Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, though she made no further reply. She couldn't yet. Her body was still recovering, and her mind was reeling from the trauma of the storm. Luke noticed the fine fabrics of her partially thawed coat, the intricate stitching on her gloves, luxury that had no place out here in the frozen plains. He frowned slightly, curiosity flickering in his mind, but he didn't ask. Right now, survival mattered. The rest, her wealth, her status, her past, could wait. As night fell, the storm's howling had softened to a low moan. But Luke stayed by her side. He tended the fire, refilled the kettle, and watched her breathing. Every now and then she shivered, and he instinctively draped the quilt more tightly around her, pressing her closer to the warmth of his chest. It was a strange feeling, one he hadn't experienced in years, a protective, almost paternal need to shield her from the world. His own hands were numb from the cold she had brought in with her, yet he didn't care. The woman lying before him was fragile, and he would not let her die on his watch. She began to stir more, murmuring fragments of sentences, her mind slowly emerging from the haze of frost and fear. Luke listened patiently, never interrupting, just offering the steady presence she seemed to cling to. When she attempted to rise, he gently pushed her back onto the quilt. "Don't move too much," he warned, though the harshness of his voice softened under concern. "You need rest. You've been through hell." Eventually, exhaustion claimed her. She lay there, curling slightly under the thick quilt, and Luke felt a momentary relief he hadn't realized he would experience. He had saved her for now, but the uncertainty of what would come next gnawed at him. Who was she, truly? Why had she been out in the storm alone? The questions were endless, but for the first time in a long while, Luke felt the warmth of responsibility, the weight of someone else's life resting in his hands. He stepped back, allowing her a small measure of privacy, and glanced out the window at the snow still falling softly. The plains were silent now, peaceful, yet the storm's memory lingered. He returned to his vigil, sitting by the fire, his thoughts a mixture of worry, curiosity, and something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. When she finally murmured his name in sleep, barely audible, Luke felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. He had rescued countless cattle, fought off wild animals, survived near death himself, but nothing had ever stirred him like this fragile human life. Her presence in his cabin, broken and shivering, demanded a tenderness he had long buried under the harshness of the frontier. By morning, faint color had returned to her face, and she blinked against the new light filtering through the window. She looked up at him with wary gratitude, and for the first time, Luke allowed himself to hope. Maybe she would survive. Maybe, just maybe, she could heal. Physically, and perhaps in other ways too. But Luke knew, deep down, that life would never be the same again. He didn't know it yet, but the frozen woman he had pulled from the storm would change everything. His life, his heart, and the path that lay ahead. Morning light spilled through the cabin's small windows, casting soft shadows on the wooden walls. The storm had passed, leaving the plains pristine and silent, a sparkling blanket of snow stretching as far as the eye could see. Eleanor, the woman Luke had rescued, sat wrapped in his old quilt, staring at the horizon with eyes still tinged with frost, but filled with a kind of wonder. She had survived the blizzard, and for the first time, in what felt like years, she allowed herself to breathe without panic. Luke had insisted she rest until she regained her strength, and though she had done so reluctantly, she now felt capable of taking small steps. Luke moved around the cabin, preparing breakfast, eggs, bacon, and bread freshly baked the day before. The smell filled the room, blending with the lingering warmth of the fire. Eleanor watched him quietly, fascinated by the simplicity of his life. She had lived in grand houses, dined in candlelit halls, and traveled on luxurious carriages, yet here, in this small, humble cabin, warmth and sustenance were made with care, not wealth. "You didn't have to," she said softly, her voice fragile, betraying both awe and gratitude. "I did," Luke replied without hesitation. "You'd have died out there. That's enough for me." She looked down at the food, hesitating. The thought of eating so plainly, without servants or silverware, felt alien. But hunger won over hesitation, and she took a small bite, savoring the warmth and the simple flavors. Luke watched her, noticing the subtle way she relaxed into the moment, as though the snowstorm outside had stripped away not just her clothing, but the layers of formality and fear she had carried her entire life. Over the next few days, Eleanor regained strength, slowly moving about the cabin, helping with chores, learning to carry water from the well without stumbling. Luke observed her with quiet admiration. She was graceful, intelligent, and yet wholly vulnerable, a combination that tugged at him in ways he had never anticipated. He didn't press for answers about her life outside the cabin. The questions lingered unspoken, but he respected her silence. She had survived a storm, and that survival, he realized, was a testament not just to luck, but to inner strength. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, painting the snow in hues of gold and rose, Eleanor finally broke the quiet. "Luke, I need to tell you something," she began, her voice wavering slightly. She looked at him, her green eyes catching the fading light, searching for a reaction. "I'm not just some traveler. I'm the richest woman in the West." Luke blinked, momentarily stunned. The revelation hit him like a gust of wind. For a second, the room felt smaller, the firelight dancing uncertainly on the walls. "Richest woman in the West," he repeated,